The moment Flight AA 1147 leveled off at 35,000 feet somewhere over the dark spine of the Appalachian Mountains, the woman in seat 14B stood up, pointed her acrylic nail directly at the silver-haired man in seat 14A, and screamed 3 words that would change her life forever. Arrest this man. 287 passengers on American Airlines Flight 1147, a Boeing 737-800 operating the Chicago O'Hare to Washington Dulles route on a steel-gray Tuesday morning in November, went completely silent. The normal white noise of a cruising aircraft, the deep, resonant hum of 2 CFM56 engines, the faint whisper of recirculated cabin air through overhead vents, the occasional clink of ice in a drink cart 3 rows back. All of it seemed to hold its breath. Because when a passenger stands up at altitude and demands another passenger be arrested, the rules of gravity don't just apply to the aircraft. They apply to every social order inside it, too. The silver-haired man in 14A did not move. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, a navy blazer pressed and neat despite 6 hours of travel already behind him. His posture was exact, military exact. The kind of stillness that comes not from passivity but from a lifetime of knowing when to speak and when to let a situation speak for itself. He turned his head slowly toward the screaming woman and said nothing. His eyes, pale gray and steady as instrument gauges, gave away less than a cockpit readout at cruising altitude. The woman, we'll come to know her very well in the next few minutes, was already vibrating at a frequency that the aircraft's fuselage was not designed to contain. Her face had gone the color of the emergency exit signs mounted every few rows along the cabin ceiling. She was gripping the top of seat 14B so hard that her knuckles had gone white beneath her tan. The oversized Louis Vuitton tote she'd crammed into the overhead bin was now dangling open beside her. A tube of hand cream rolling down the aisle as though even her belongings were trying to escape. "He touched me," she announced to the cabin. "He deliberately invaded my personal space, and I want him removed from this aircraft." A flight attendant named Jessica, 16 years with American Airlines, trained for exactly these scenarios and then some, appeared from the galley at the front of the cabin with the practiced calm of someone who has seen every version of this scene. She placed herself at the end of the row and used the measured voice that flight attendants are trained to use in the way surgeons are trained to hold a scalpel, with precision without wasted motion. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and take your seat." The woman turned to Jessica as if she had just been personally insulted by the aircraft itself. "Do you know who I am?" she said. And here is where Flight 1147 took its first, irrevocable turn toward something none of the 287 passengers on board would ever forget. Because in that moment, 2 rows behind the silver-haired man, for men in different kinds of civilian clothing, khakis, dark jeans, a gray sweater, a flannel shirt, all made the same almost imperceptible movement. They shifted. They sat forward. They looked at the silver-haired man in 14A, then at each other with expressions that were not surprise, not curiosity, not the rubbernecking interest of ordinary passengers witnessing ordinary drama. What passed between those 4 men was recognition, and something else, something that looked, unmistakably, like fury held on a very short leash. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand why the next 40 minutes of Flight 1147 would end with 1 passenger in federal custody, another passenger receiving a standing ovation from the entire coach cabin, and a senior official of the Transportation Security Administration quietly weeping in the front row out of sheer relief, you need to go back. All the way back to a gate at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, Terminal 3, at 6:47 in the morning. You need to go back to where this story actually started, which was not, as it turns out, on the aircraft at all. Her name was Diane Howell, though the cabin crew of Flight 1147 would later refer to her in their incident reports by a different name, the kind of name that gets used when the report writer is trying to be professional but also deeply, bone-achingly tired. Diane was 44 years old, a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical distribution company based in the northern suburbs of Chicago. She drove a leased Lexus. She had a platinum card with American Airlines and a gold card with Marriott, and she carried both of these facts around with her the way other people carry oxygen, as though without them she might simply cease to function. She had been a difficult traveler for as long as anyone who had ever worked with her could remember. The complaints began in earnest somewhere around 2018, when she discovered that airline customer service lines could be weaponized with enough persistence and volume. By 2022, she had logged 47 formal complaints with American Airlines alone. Not about delayed flights or lost luggage, the legitimate grievances that most passengers accumulate over years of travel. Diane's complaints were a different species entirely. She had complained that a flight attendant had looked at her with an attitude. She had complained that the man next to her on a Denver flight had been breathing audibly. She had filed a written grievance against a gate agent in Dallas for failing to address her as ma'am with what she felt was adequate sincerity. She had, on 2 separate occasions, demanded that fellow passengers be moved because she found their appearance unsettling. Both times, the airline had apologized, offered her miles, and quietly noted her account with flags that meant something to the customer service team and nothing at all to the check-in systems that kept printing her boarding passes. On the morning of Flight 1147, Diane arrived at O'Hare in the kind of mood that people who know this type of person will recognize immediately. It was the mood that comes from a combination of too little sleep, too much entitlement, and a deep structural conviction that the world has been organized poorly and that she alone has noticed. She had already called American Airlines twice before arriving at the airport, once to confirm her seat upgrade, which had not come through, and once to complain about the fact that the upgrade had not come through. She wore sunglasses indoors. She had 2 rolling bags and a personal item, and she knew perfectly well that 2 rolling bags exceeded carry-on policy, and she had packed them that way anyway because in Diane's experience, policies were suggestions that applied to other people. The gate agent who checked her in that morning was a young man named Marco, 23 years old and 8 months into the job, and he handled her bags with the kind of patient diplomacy that his training had promised would eventually become second nature. He apologized for the upgrade, offered her a window seat in row 14, and printed her boarding pass with a smile that cost him something. Diane accepted it without looking at him. She was at the gate 40 minutes before boarding when she noticed him. He was sitting 3 seats down from her in the gate area, the silver-haired man she would later demand be arrested at 35,000 feet. He was reading a physical newspaper, which she found immediately suspicious in some way she could not articulate. He was in his early 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and the lean, economical build of a man who had spent his adult life in motion. He wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a navy blazer, brown leather shoes that had been polished recently, but he wore them the way certain men wear civilian clothes, which is to say as a costume over something else entirely. Something more permanent. He was also, and this is the detail that lodged in Diane's mind like a splinter, sitting in seat 14A, which was the window seat in her row. Now, to be clear, 14A was not Diane's seat. Diane had been assigned 14B, the middle. She had been told there were no aisle or window seats remaining in her row. And yet something about the presence of this man in the window seat next to where she would be sitting, his stillness, his newspaper, his unhurried possession of the space, struck her as a personal affront. As though he had taken something that belonged to her by some right she had never formally been granted but felt nonetheless. She sat down. She watched him. She began narrating to herself in the way that people like Diane narrate to themselves, building a story about a man she had never met, would never introduce herself to, and knew nothing about. By the time boarding was called, she had decided several things about him, none of which were true, and she boarded the aircraft in row 14 carrying all of them like loaded luggage. He was already in his seat when she arrived at row 14. He was folding the newspaper into a precise square. He stood to let her past, excused himself with the brief, considered politeness of someone who has had good manners for so long they have become structural, and settled back into 14A with his newspaper on his knee. Diane wedged herself into 14B, immediately opened her tote, and began taking up the armrest. He did not fight for the armrest. This also irritated her. The seat on the other side of Diane, 14C, was occupied by a heavy-set man named Gerald from Rockford who had put on headphones before the jetway door closed and had indicated in every way available to him that he intended to have no interaction with any human being for the duration of the flight. Diane made a show of adjusting herself between the two of them, sighing loudly, putting her tote partially under Gerald's seat by mistake, extracting it, accidentally elbowing the silver-haired man as she did so, and then freezing. "I'm so sorry," the silver-haired man said, with the reflex of someone apologizing for someone else's mistake as naturally as breathing. He shifted slightly toward the window. Diane stared at him. "You should be," she said. He returned to his newspaper. This was the first exchange between Diane Howell and retired Chief of Police Daniel Marcus Grayson, formerly of the Chicago Police Department, recipient of the Medal of Valor in 1998 and 2004, architect of the department's field training officer program for 21 consecutive years, and the man who had personally trained or overseen the training of more than 340 sworn officers, including, as fate and a Tuesday morning American Airlines schedule would have it, four of the men currently seated within 8 rows of him on Flight 1147. The boarding continued. The safety demonstration played. The aircraft pushed back from gate H-14 at 7:11 in the morning, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, and taxied toward runway 28 are in the pale November light. In those minutes between pushback and rotation, Diane cataloged her grievances. She noted that the silver-haired man had adjusted the window shade without asking her. She noted that his elbow, she was now certain, was 1 inch over the armrest divider. She noted that he had declined the flight attendant's offer of a pre-departure beverage, and that he had done so with a brevity that she interpreted as rudeness, even though he had said no, thank you, with complete courtesy. She built her case the way people like Diane build cases, brick by brick, each brick manufactured from a material that does not exist in the physical world. At 31 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft climbed through 18,000 feet and the seatbelt sign chimed off, the passenger in 16B, a man in a gray sweater who had been reading a novel since pushback, looked up briefly at the back of the silver-haired man's head and made eye contact with the man in 15D across the aisle. Something passed between them. They looked away. They returned to their reading. At 49 minutes into the flight, Diane asked a flight attendant named Renee to tell the man next to her to stop hogging the armrest. Renee arrived, assessed the armrest situation. The silver-haired man's elbow was fractionally near the divider, well within any reasonable interpretation of shared space, and told Diane, with the same surgical calm that Jessica would deploy later, that she would note her concern. She smiled at the silver-haired man briefly. He gave a small nod that managed to communicate both acknowledgement and perfect understanding of what was happening. At 1 hour and 12 minutes, Diane pressed the call button. Renee arrived. Diane told her that the man next to her was making her uncomfortable, and she wanted him moved. Renee explained that the flight was 91% full, and there were no seats available in the same cabin. Diane told Renee that was unacceptable. Renee told Diane she understood and was sorry, and meant neither of these things in the way she said them. The silver-haired man in 14A read his newspaper. What the other passengers in the surrounding rows had begun to notice, because confined aircraft cabins are extraordinary environments for the observation of human behavior, with no ambient noise to cover conversation, no physical distance to soften conflict, and nowhere, absolutely nowhere, to look except at each other, was that the silver-haired man had not reacted. Not once. He had not sighed. He had not rolled his eyes. He had not sought sympathy from Gerald in 14C, who would not have provided any. He sat and he read, and he existed in his seat with a composure so complete that several passengers had independently begun to suspect it was not ordinary patience. It was something trained, something practiced over years of encounters that made this one look, by comparison, extremely manageable. The man in the gray sweater in 16B had stopped reading his novel 40 minutes ago. He was watching the back of row 14 with an expression that was now impossible to read as casual. At 1 hour and 38 minutes into Flight 1147, approximately over the eastern edge of Ohio at an altitude of 35,000 feet, Diane Howell reached across and pressed the call button for the 3rd time. When Jessica arrived, Diane pointed at the silver-haired man and said, in a voice calibrated to be heard by the surrounding 6 rows, "I want this man removed from the aircraft. He has been harassing me since we boarded, and I do not feel safe." The silver-haired man in 14A lowered his newspaper. He looked at Jessica. He said with perfect, unhurried calm, "I have been reading. I have not spoken to this woman since we boarded except to apologize when she elbowed me during boarding. I'd be happy to share my account of the flight so far, if that's helpful. Jessica looked at Diane. Jessica looked at the man. Jessica had been doing this for 16 years. She knew exactly what she was looking at. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice," she said to Diane. That's when Diane stood up. That's when she pointed the acrylic nail. That's when she said the 3 words that split the flight into before and after. "Arrest this man." And that is where we began. 35,000 feet over the eastern United States, on a Boeing 737-800 with 287 souls on board, with a retired chief of police sitting very still in seat 14A and a woman who did not yet understand what she had done standing over him in seat 14B. Jessica did not raise her voice. This was, in retrospect, the most terrifying thing she could have done, because it told everyone in earshot that the situation had moved into a category where voices were no longer the appropriate tool. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet and very level. "I need you to sit down right now." "I am not sitting down," Diane said. "I am a platinum member of the A Advantage program and I have the right to feel safe on this aircraft, and this man," she pointed again, "has been making me unsafe since Chicago. Can you describe specifically what he has done? He's been in my space. He's been watching me. He won't stop looking at me." "Ma'am, are you saying he has physically touched you or threatened you?" "He touched me when I was getting my bag during boarding." "That was her elbow," said Gerald in 14C, removing one earbud with the expression of a man who has tried very hard to stay uninvolved and has failed. "She hit him with her elbow and he apologized." Diane turned on Gerald with a fury that made him replace the earbud with some speed. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "Ma'am," Jessica's voice had not moved, "I need you to be seated. If you do not sit down, I am required to notify the captain." "Notify the captain. Go ahead. Notify everyone. This man is a criminal and he needs to be arrested." From the row behind the silver-haired man, a voice said, "Ma'am, I think you should stop." It was a calm voice, careful, professional, the voice of someone who was choosing their words with great deliberateness. The man who spoke was in seat 15A, a window seat, 1 row back, wearing a flannel shirt and dark jeans. He looked like someone who might work in construction or maybe own a small landscaping company. He had short dark hair going gray at the temples and the particular stillness in his jaw that comes from biting back the first 3 things you wanted to say. Diane turned and looked at him. "And who are you?" "Nobody," the man said. "Just a passenger." This was not true, but we will come to that. Jessica walked swiftly forward to the galley and picked up the interphone. What the passengers near the front of the cabin heard was not the content of the call but its length. It was very short. And then, almost immediately, the distinctive soft chime of the captain's interphone call ringing in the cockpit. Captain Sandra Reyes had been flying for American for 19 years. She listened to her senior flight attendant's 30-second summary and then did exactly what her training required. She made an announcement. She reviewed the flight decks authority under FAA Regulation 14 CFR Part 121.580, and she asked, very specifically, whether any law enforcement personnel were on board. The PA announcement came through the cabin with the calm, formal authority of a captain who had handled diversions, medical emergencies, and full passenger evacuations and had learned that the voice that keeps an airplane calm is the voice that sounds as though it has never been anything but. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reyes. We are currently at cruise altitude over Ohio. I want to make you aware that we are monitoring a situation in the main cabin. I want to remind all passengers that federal regulations prohibit interference with crew member duties and prohibit any conduct that endangers the safety of the aircraft or its occupants. I want to ask if any active or retired law enforcement or federal agents are on board and willing to assist the crew. If so, please press your call button now." In the cabin, for 1 suspended second, nothing moved. And then 5 call buttons lit up. Not 1, not 2, 5. In rows 13 through 18, 5 individual overhead call lights went amber in the recirculated air of the 737's main cabin. And the sound that went through the passengers in those rows was not the sound of surprise. It was the sound of understanding arriving ahead of comprehension. Jessica came back down the aisle. She stopped at 16B first, the gray sweater, and bent to speak quietly to the man there. He nodded. She moved to 15D across the aisle. Another nod. Then 15A, the flannel shirt. Another nod. This one accompanied by the man briefly pressing his eyes closed in an expression that was not patience so much as controlled grief. Then 13C. Then 17A. 5 stops. 5 quiet conversations. 5 men who had all pressed their call buttons within 3 seconds of each other. Diane was still standing. She had watched this process with growing confusion and a shift in her expression that was the first crack in the confidence she had been carrying like body armor since O'Hare. "What is happening?" she demanded of no one in particular. "What is going on?" The man in 15A, flannel shirt, dark hair, the one who had told her to stop, was the one who stood up first. He was not a large man, but he stood in a way that took up his exact amount of space and not a millimeter less. He reached into the back pocket of his dark jeans and produced a credential wallet. He held it out in a way that was practiced. Flat, open, badge facing out, and he said to Diane, in a voice that carried exactly as far as he intended it to, "Detective First Class Ray Ochoa, Chicago PD, currently traveling to Washington, D.C. to testify in a federal case. I'm going to need you to sit down." Diane stared at the badge. From 16B, the gray sweater was standing now too. He produced his own credentials from the breast pocket of his sweater. "Officer David Kwan, Chicago PD, off-duty." From 15D, Sergeant Marcus Webb, CPD. From 13C, Officer Priya Nair, currently detailed to the U.S. Marshals Service. From 17A, Special Agent Tom Delgado, FBI. The cabin had gone so quiet that the engine noise seemed to increase to fill it. 5 law enforcement officers. On one flight, in a 9-row radius of seat 14A. Diane looked at the 5 standing figures arrayed around her and then, as though seeing it for the first time, looked down at the man still seated quietly in 14A. The silver-haired man who had been reading his newspaper. The man she had been demanding be arrested for the last 97 minutes. He looked up at her. His gray eyes were the same as they had been at the gate, steady as gauges, measuring nothing because there was nothing left to measure. "Chief Grayson," Detective Ochoa said, and his voice had changed. It was not the measured voice he'd used with Diane. It was something older and different, the voice of someone addressing someone they have spent years looking up to, and he couldn't fully hide it. "Are you all right, sir?" And the silver-haired man said, "I'm fine, Ray. Thank you." The moment stretched. Diane opened her mouth, closed it. "Chief," said Officer Kwan from 16B, and his voice had that same quality. Respectful, personal, aimed at someone specific. "Chief Grayson. Daniel Grayson, retired Chief of Police. 29 years with the Chicago Police Department. Medal of Valor twice. Architect of the Field Training Officer program that had produced, over 2 decades, hundreds of sworn officers, including Detective Ray Ochoa, his 3rd year on the job, who Grayson had personally pulled out of a disciplinary review and guided through the hardest year of his career. Including Officer David Kwan, whose training Grayson had supervised when Kwan was 22 years old and making every mistake in the book. Until one afternoon Grayson sat him down and talked to him for 3 hours and Kwan never made those mistakes again. Sergeant Marcus Webb, who had Grayson's direct phone number still saved in his contacts under Chief and had never deleted it. Officer Priya Nair, whose letter of commendation Grayson had written personally when she made detective. Special Agent Tom Delgado, who had started as a patrol officer under Grayson's watch before moving to the Bureau. 5 people who, in their various ways, owed their careers to the man in 14A. 5 people who had watched for the last 97 minutes as a woman in 14B attempted to destroy him at 35,000 feet. "Ma'am." Officer Nair's voice was the most controlled of all of them, and also somehow the coldest. "You are going to want to sit down right now." Diane sat down. What happened in the next 7 minutes happened with the efficiency of people who know procedures cold, who have run through variations of this scenario in simulations and in the field, and who are currently operating on an extremely short leash in a confined pressurized tube moving at 530 miles per hour over Ohio. Captain Reyes came on the PA again and announced that law enforcement personnel were assisting the crew and that all other passengers should remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. She did not announce what she had already decided. That Flight 1147 would be landing at Dulles as scheduled, where law enforcement on the ground had already been notified because Officer Nair had called it in on her federal detail phone 60 seconds after standing up. Jessica and Renee worked the forward section of the cabin with water and the practiced verbal comfort of experienced crew members. Short sentences, eye contact, nothing that could be misinterpreted. The passengers in the surrounding rows had, by now, fully understood what they were watching. A woman in 12D reached out and touched the silver-haired man's arm as he sat, gentle, brief. The instinctive human impulse to make contact with someone who has been treated unjustly. He acknowledged it with a small nod. Diane was told, by Detective Ochoa standing at the end of her row, that she would remain in her seat for the remainder of the flight, that she was not to press the call button, that she was not to speak to any other passenger, and that on landing she would be met by federal and local law enforcement who had been briefed on the situation. He used no anger. He used no threats beyond the factual description of her current situation. He was as calm as a man who has delivered this kind of news 100 times and knows that the stillness is what lands. Diane looked at him. Her face had gone through a remarkable sequence of expressions in the past 7 minutes. Shock, then disbelief, then a brief and doomed attempt at reconstruction of the narrative in which she was still the wronged party, and had arrived somewhere pale and quiet that was, for the first time on this flight, close to reality. "I didn't know," she said. It was the smallest she had sounded in hours, maybe years. "No," Ochoa said. "You didn't." He turned back to his seat. In 14A, Daniel Grayson had folded his newspaper again. He was looking at the oval window and the flat gray American sky beyond it. His hands were still folded in his lap. A flight attendant came and offered him coffee, and he accepted it this time, wrapping both hands around the small cup, and in that simple gesture, the retired chief of police, the man with the medals and the trainees and the 30 years of service, holding a paper cup of airplane coffee with both hands. Something in the surrounding passengers cracked open just slightly. The applause started in 15A. Detective Ochoa, sitting back down, started it. Not a public performance, just the honest, involuntary response of someone who had spent 22 minutes watching his mentor sit in absolute dignity while someone tried to dismantle him, and could not contain it anymore. It spread to 16B, then across the aisle, then forward, then backward, a wave moving through the cabin of Flight 1147 at 35,000 feet with the unstoppable physics of something that has been held back too long. 287 passengers applauded in a Boeing 737-800 cabin over Ohio, and Diane Howell sat in 14B and looked at the seat back in front of her, and the engine hum that had been the background of this entire flight seemed, in that moment, to be the loudest sound in the world. The wheels of Flight 1147 touched the runway at Washington Dulles International Airport at 10:17 in the morning, 4 minutes ahead of schedule. Captain Reyes brought the aircraft in with the smooth, uneventful landing of someone who has landed thousands of times and takes the mechanics of it personally. As the thrust reversers engaged and the speed bled off down the runway, she made one final PA announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington Dulles. I want to thank our passengers for your patience and cooperation today. On behalf of myself and the crew of American Airlines Flight 1147, we want to extend our deepest appreciation to Chief Daniel Grayson for his many years of service to the city of Chicago and to this country." She paused one beat. "We're honored to have had you on board today, Chief, even if the circumstances weren't what any of us would have chosen." In row 14A, the silver-haired man looked at the overhead speaker for a moment. Then he looked at the window. Then he looked at his hands. And the passengers near enough to see him would later tell each other, in the gate area, on the train, in the rideshare apps they opened while still on the taxiway, that his expression in that moment was not triumph. It was not vindication. It was something quieter and more complicated than both of those things. It was the expression of a man who has spent his whole life building something. A program, a department, a generation of officers, and has just been shown, in the most unlikely classroom imaginable, that it worked. Diane Howell was the last passenger off the aircraft. She did not leave because she chose to. She left because 2 Dulles Airport police officers and 1 TSA supervisor were waiting at the jet bridge door, and she had no other option. The charges filed against her that afternoon were not trivial. Interference with a flight crew member under 49 U.S.C. Section 46,504 carries a maximum penalty of 20 years. Filing a false police report, which her formal demand for arrest constituted under federal aviation statutes once it was established that no assault had occurred, added a secondary charge. American Airlines, whose legal team had reviewed the incident report from the crew before the aircraft had finished its taxi to the gate, was already in contact with their attorneys about the full scope of civil liability she had created. She was banned from American Airlines before sunset. The no-fly list referral was submitted to the TSA within 72 hours of landing. Her employer, notified not by the airline but by the news coverage that erupted 36 hours after a video taken by a passenger in row 18 was posted to social media, placed her on administrative leave by Wednesday morning. The video, which showed nothing of Diane's face but captured the entire sequence of 5 law enforcement officers standing to identify themselves and the subsequent silence in the cabin, received 11 million views in 4 days. Detective Ochoa gave a brief statement to a Chicago Tribune reporter, which he cleared through the department's public affairs office, and which contained the following sentence. "Chief Grayson trained me. He trained most of the people I know. There's nothing I wouldn't do for that man. And that was true at 35,000 feet, the same as it's true on the ground." Chief Grayson himself gave no statement. He did give one interview, brief, to a reporter from the Chicago Sun-Times who had covered the department for 15 years and whom Grayson trusted. He said, "I've been in situations a lot scarier than that one. What struck me, honestly, was the crew. Those flight attendants handled an impossible situation with real skill and real grace. They're the ones who deserve the recognition." He did not mention Diane Howell by name. American Airlines sent a formal letter of apology to Chief Grayson, accompanied by a full refund of his ticket, an upgrade to business class for any future travel, and a private acknowledgement from the airline's CEO that the incident would inform staff training protocols around passenger conflict situations. The field training program Grayson had designed for the Chicago PD, the one from which Ochoa, Kwan, Webb, Nair, and Delgado had all graduated, was cited in a subsequent Aviation Security Working Group report as a model for the kind of de-escalation discipline that the airline industry should consider integrating into ground crew training. The passenger in 14C, Gerald from Rockford, who had removed one earbud to correct the record about the elbow, and then replaced it, was later contacted by a journalist looking for passenger accounts. He declined to comment. He was photographed deplaning, headphones still on, expression unchanged, and the photograph circulated briefly under captions that called him, not inaccurately, a hero. There is a particular kind of justice that arrives not as punishment but as revelation. It does not always come where or when we expect it. It arrived on a Tuesday morning on a 737 over Ohio, where a woman who had spent years mistaking volume for power discovered, at altitude, with nowhere to go, that the world she had been performing for was not, in fact, the audience she had assumed. The audience was watching her. And the audience included, on this particular Tuesday, 5 people who knew exactly what kind of man she had chosen to perform against, and who had spent the better part of a decade learning from him how to be still and precise and right when everything around them was loud. If this story landed with you, if you felt that particular satisfaction of watching dignity confirmed and arrogance corrected at exactly the worst possible moment for the arrogance, share it. Send it to the person in your life who has ever watched someone like Diane Howell work a room and wanted, desperately, for the room to push back. Because sometimes it does. Sometimes, on a 737 at 35,000 feet over Ohio on a Tuesday in November, it does. Next time on this channel, a woman demands a first-class passenger be moved for taking up too much air. The passenger is the airline's chief medical officer.